I think that's why they come. Okay, Genesis 17:9. And God said to Abraham, so now we finally reached the point last week where he's no longer Abram, but Abraham, father of many nations. As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So this is where we begin with this whole idea of circumcision. An idea that marks the Jews as God's people, but at the same time reminds them that they're God's people and about the covenant that God has made with them. Let's see. At 8 days old, the male babies would be circumcised as a sign of their belonging to Israel. And if a Jew refused to be, it was like if a mother and father didn't want to circumcise their child for whatever reason, they would get the punishment that's worse than death, to be cut off. Because as a Jew, the rest of the world doesn't like you, doesn't want anything to do with you in most cases. So then if you're cut off from Israel, you're on your own. And that's very, very difficult, especially in their day, and especially if you were born and raised a Jew, because they're a very close community. So in most cases, that was actually worse than if they just killed you. And you find that it's a punishment when we get to the law given by God to the Jews, that often that's the final, ultimate punishment is to be kicked out and exiled from the Jews. Even the servants they bought from foreigners were to be circumcised. Every male, whether they're of Jewish blood or not. And this is one of the few commands that God gave that the Jews followed all throughout their history. This they kept up with. Now, during the Greek period, there were some who didn't, and we'll get to that in a minute, but by and large, the Jewish community did. And it was kept them separate from other people. Now, they're not the only ancient people that did this. There was circumcision in Egypt that they did as well. But these are the only people where everyone was circumcised throughout their entire history, all males. With Egypt, it was a thing that they did it and then they didn't do it, and it wasn't a sign of anything. Now, part of this was also the fact that it was another way that God kept the Jews separate from the other people, so they didn't intermarry and disappear, as most of the ancient peoples did. That's what happened to most of them. They would finally, like an empire is finally conquered by another empire, then they deport people, they move people in, people intermarry, and then pretty soon the ethnic people of the previous empire are gone. Like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, and on it goes. That they genetically cease being that. So now, let's see. This is one of the reasons that the Jews could not participate in the Greek games. Remember, that was a huge part of Greek culture. That's where our Olympics come from. So they had multiple huge games a year. But how did the men dress for the sporting events?
Skirts. Wasn't it skirts?
Nope. If you were participating, it was in the nude.
Oh.
So if you were a Jew, you couldn't participate because they could immediately tell you were a Jew. And this is the one period I was talking about where there were some Jews who either didn't get circumcised because they were what we call Hellenized Jews, Jews that were Greek. The Greeks did not call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Hellenes. It's the Romans that called them Greeks. And that's the name that stuck. But that's why you'll hear it bounce back and forth between the Hellenistic period, that's the Greek period, or Greek. And it's funny how they'll use both interchangeably, and it can get real confusing, but it's the same people. And so there were Hellenistic Jews. Just even in the New Testament, you'll notice there are Jews that predominantly speak Greek. Those are the Hellenized Jews. Then there are the Jews that speak both Greek and Hebrew, but Hebrew is their first language. Those are the more dedicated Jews. And there were some of the Hellenized Jews who either weren't circumcised or, believe it or not, the Greeks had a surgery that they could reverse it. But it was horrifically painful. But there were guys that went through it just so they could participate in the games. Because, if you were a Hellenized Jew, that was a huge part of their culture. And you were locked out from being able to participate because of your circumcision. And it is through the Jews and then through the early Christians that the Western world, Europe and America, continued to circumcise throughout time. Because as far as I can find anywhere, there is no real health benefit or anything like that to circumcision. It's something, it's just like the food laws that he gave the Jews. The food laws of the Jews are not healthier than any other way to eat. God did it just so they'd be separate from other people. Right. And it's the same thing with circumcision. It marked them as Jews and kept them separate from other people. And so that they would maintain their Jewish genetics. Well, let's see. So this was the ultimate sign that they were a special people. Because this was with them all the time. They were reminded constantly. And God did this in a lot of different ways. He had to put up monuments around the country. He had things like their laws for eating, the circumcision. All of that was to constantly remind them who they are. Or maybe better to say whose they are. That they're different. That they're a special people. That they're chosen by God. All that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, none of that worked. They still rejected Christ. They still rejected God's law. That kind of thing. So, but it was a constant reminder. Okay, now go to 17:15. And God said to Abram, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So, the Bible doesn't tell us the difference between what Sarai and Sarah means. They both tend to mean princess. And so she's called princess. God changes her name because he changed Abraham's name. Because now she's not going to be the mother of a nation. She's going to be a mother of many nations, like we looked at last week. The Kenizzites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, they came from their descendants Ishmael, and then the Arabians came from Ishmael, and the others I mentioned came from Esau. So she ends up being the mother of many nations. The reason God names her princess is because in most kingdoms, that's who bears the rulers and kings of nations are princesses. And so that's why her name is princess, because she's going to be the mother of several nations and many kings. So she's going to be the mother of kings, plural. And so each of these kings, such as through Esau, the Edomites, Kenizzites, Amalekites, they each become their own small nation. They have their own kings. Same with the Arabians, which come from Ishmael, which that's not from her. That's from Abraham. But these are from her side. She's still going to be the mother of kings and many nations. Now, what is Abraham's response? He laughs. It's kind of hard to tell from the context whether he's laughing because like how sometimes you just, God says something amazing and you kind of laugh about it. Not in a way that you don't believe it, just that it's pretty astounding. Or, this is what I think, because of what he says next, I think his faith is wavering. I mean, he's 100. She's 90. He's like, right. Are we really going to have kids? It's kind of hard to imagine at that age and time of life.
Do we want kids at this time?
Well, could you imagine being 90 and having 92 and having a 2-year-old to chase around the tent? God must have given them lots of energy, even though they were old.
That's why God doesn't give old women kids, because they forget where they put them.
Yep. Can't remember their names either. When I was a kid, because I have 4 brothers and sisters, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and my mom would want one of us, and she would call every name,
Yep,
and we knew who she wanted, but of course we wouldn't go. So she'd even use the dogs' names before she'd finally get to us. And finally, sometimes she'd just say, "Oh, whoever you are, you know who I'm talking to," kind of thing. So, but that's true. That's what I think. Like with Leah's kids, especially when they were younger. I'm like, when you're in your 60s, you don't have the energy for 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds like I did when I was 30. You know, that's for young. That's why old guys marry young women. You know, they can chase the people. When you see these guys that are in their 70s, movie stars especially, they marry 20-year-old women and have kids. You're like, well, I'm 70, but let her watch them. You know? All right, verse 18. We'll find out, get a better idea of where kind of Abraham is. And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." That's the line that makes me think his faith is wavering. He's basically saying there that Ishmael might inherit the promise because he's a son that's alive, you know, that came from Abraham's lineage. God says, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes." Sound familiar? You know, there's 12 fathers to the nation of Israel. God does the same through Ishmael. There will be 12 princes that come through him. "And I will make him into a great nation," the nation that we know of today as Saudi Arabia. Is basically that nation. "But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." So she's not pregnant yet, but she's going to be pregnant very soon because she'll be born within the next year. So that whole idea about Ishmael makes me think his faith is wavering, which it has wavered before. But God says, no, absolutely not. The promise will be fulfilled through Sarah. She will have a son. And Isaac means laughter. Because who's laughing now? And what's interesting is all around the mention of Isaac, up until the point that he's born, laughter pops up all the time. And that's his name. Because once she actually does have him, that causes Sarah to laugh in joy. But prior to that, Sarah laughs in unbelief as well, which is here. Where am I? Nope, not the War of Independence. I forgot to get through this slide. There. Nope. Still off. I'm off by one slide. Laughter. Sarah laughed at the idea of being pregnant. So in Genesis 18:12, just a little, farther down. So Sarah laughed at herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Shall I have a child?" So she laughed. And then, if you remember, the men that were there telling them that, the servants of God, said, "Why are you laughing?" And she says, "I'm not laughing." Kind of thing. Then we go on to Genesis 21:6 and 7, and everyone laughed in joy who heard once she was pregnant. And Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." And then, but there's also a bad one. And this is Ishmael laughing in mockery. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Remember, he's 13, 14 by the time he's born. And so he's laughing because in derision over Isaac. Let's see. Now God reiterates the covenant is with Isaac, not Ishmael. But Ishmael will still be the father of a lot of people down through time. But also he'll be the father of the people that hate the Jews and cause enormous problems for thousands of years. It's still happening today. And here's a point where we can kind of begin to understand why some of the Muslims hate Jews. Not all Muslims hate Jews, but a huge portion of them do. Some just don't like them. Some hate them and actually want to wipe them out as though they never existed. That's one of their primary goals of almost all of the Muslim terrorists. And the reason they go after the United States is twofold. Because we're Israel's huge ally that makes them strong enough to fight against all of the Arabs. But also because we're a free nation. Because remember, under Sharia law, there's no freedom. Especially not for women. It's a very binding, very stifling set of laws. So the reason they do is they believe that Isaac usurped the promise from Ishmael. He's the firstborn. By their, I lose this word all the time. By their customs, who should inherit?
The
The firstborn. Who should be the one that gets the promise? The firstborn. That's Ishmael. But God chooses Isaac over their normal way of doing things. So they believe that Isaac basically stole it, and that's what causes a lot of the antagonism between them, that they should have been the ones to inherit the land and all of this. But here's what we find. Often in the Bible, God skips over the firstborn. In many cases, he goes to the secondborn. And there's a purpose in all of that. If we go back to the beginning, God chose Abel over Cain. Now, what, Calvin?
Like in David and Goliath, God picked David.
Yeah, he's the last one on my list.
Yes.
You're ahead of me. So even though it was because of their offering, still the secondborn was favored over the firstborn, which is maybe part of why Cain killed him, because he's supposed to be the big kahuna, you know. He chose Jacob over Esau, even though Esau was firstborn. Only by seconds, but he was still firstborn. Now, if you remember, Jacob was even hanging on to his foot as he came out, which was a symbol of what was to come. God chose Joseph over Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn, but who's the one that saved the nation and became the ruler of Egypt? Joseph. And then, what Calvin said, God chose David over Eliab. In fact, if you remember, Samuel goes through all the boys, starting with the oldest. Can't find the one God's want. Finally has to ask, is there one more? Well, there's David, but he's a little runt out in the field with he's not king material. You know, but that's the one God chose. And the reason God bypasses the customs is he's showing that his power and his prerogative. It's his world, we're his people. He can do whatever he wants. The customs that they have, many of them came from God and his laws and rules. But God is saying, I'm not bound by the rules you're bound by. I can do what I want, and I can pick who I want and do what I want with them, because they're mine in the first place, because I made all of you.
Is Sarah part of the bloodline that goes to Mary?
Yeah. Sarah is the mother of all Jews. So absolutely, she goes to every Jew. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, everyone. I keep hearing a sound from my computer or my phone, and I'm not sure which one it is. I want to make sure it's still recording.
It's recording.
I hate that when I hear beeps and sounds and I can't figure out where they're coming from or what they mean.
We don't hear anything.
That's because they're coming through my hearing aids.
Oh.
It freaks people out because it looks like I'm talking to myself when I'm on the phone, because it's through my hearing aids.
It's a good excuse on my phone.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
So, in verse 21, finally, Abraham and Sarah get a time. Not just some point in the future. Finally, next year. The baby will be born next year. So now they've got an actual definitive date of when that's going to happen. Figure out when Okay. Verse 22. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all those born in his house are bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. They got it? They were circumcised. You notice it says it a bunch of times.
Yeah, right.
And all the men of his house, those born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So, first, how soon did Abraham carry out God's command? Immediately. God said, do it. What happened?
He did.
He did it that day. He went out and started rounding everybody up. And by the way, they did this with a flint knife. Now, people often go, oh! But I think if you remember way in the beginning, I showed you that a flint knife is actually sharper than a metal knife. And that's part of why they did it. Because there are surgeons today who use flint-tipped scalpels because they are sharper than the stainless steel scalpels. And they leave less damage and such to the skin, and there's less scarring. And in fact, the slides I had in the beginning, it even showed the highly magnified edge of a stainless steel scalpel And you can see it's pitted, even though it's razor sharp, whereas the flint one is absolutely smooth
How strong is
and
it?
super sharp.
Would it go through a rock?
Flint? No, it is a rock. Rock would bust it, but it's super sharp. And a lot of people kind of like think that stone tools are, so primitive. In a lot of cases, they're not. They're sharper than modern tools are. And they hold their edge a really long time because they don't roll over like steel does. And if they get dull, you just flake them again. And then you've got a new sharp edge on there. So they're not as primitive as people think they are. Let's see. Now, we need to be very careful to learn this lesson. When God commands us to do something, when should we do it? If it's something to be done immediately, immediately. Because we find this all throughout the Bible. The people of God, all throughout the Bible, how did they obey? Immediately. When God told Noah to build the ark, what did he do? Yeah, he picked up his tools and headed out the door and started cutting down trees. When God told Abraham to get up and go, he got up and went. Absolutely. When God told Paul to carry his message of salvation in Christ, he began as soon as he could see again. He was out preaching the gospel right away. And the beginning of his ministry went great. Everybody hated him. Everybody wanted to kill him. He got real depressed, and if you remember, they had to let him out through a window on a rope because everybody wanted to kill him. How many of us preachers would stay in the business if that's how our first ministry went? We think it's bad when there's difficulty with the congregation. At least they don't want to kill you, as happened to Paul. But they obeyed immediately. So, now we're going to jump out of Genesis for a moment and look at another important concept on this same idea that's in the model prayer. Some people call it the Lord's Prayer, but that's a really bad name. It's not his only prayer. It's when they said, teach us to pray. So it's really the model prayer. And the reason I'm doing this is because this passage is often used in ways that it has God never intended. So it says, pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The part I want to focus on is your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There are many who believe that means that Christians are to create the kingdom of God on earth, like a utopia, like heaven. There's a whole branch of Christianity that believes this, and there are even Christians within normal Bible-believing churches that believe this. That's where a lot of the social reform comes from that comes out of churches. Which is very interesting. How much social reform did Jesus preach about? None. He lived in a society that was as or more immoral than ours, with slavery and prostitution and everybody sleeping with everybody and homosexual and all that. And yet Jesus didn't really say a word. Because what does Jesus know? You don't force morality on people. You don't legislate morality. You change their hearts, and all of that changes. And that's his concern, is eternity. And that's why he didn't speak about it. And I'm not saying that churches should never get involved in social things, but I think very often we get too involved. That's not what God told us to do. He didn't tell us go out and do social ministry. He said, go out and make disciples. Now, social ministry can be a part of that, but we have to be very careful with it, that we're using it for what it was intended in the first place. So they believe that we're supposed to create this kingdom on earth, and the thing is, a primary message of the Bible is the kingdom of God is not a physical kingdom, it's a spiritual. Not a physical kingdom on this physical plane. It actually is physical, but it's in what we call the spiritual realm. Even Jesus, when he was taken to be crucified, remember what he said to Pilate? If I was the leader of a rebelling group, wouldn't all my people be out there fighting? And he says, my kingdom is not of this earth, it's a spiritual kingdom. Remember, because he says, they say you're the king of the Jews, and he goes on and says, I am, but in the spiritual sense. And that's why there's no one fighting to protect him. Plus, he didn't need it. If he didn't want to go to the cross, what do you have to do? Speak. He could have looked at Pilate and said, be gone. He's gone. He could have looked at the Roman army and said, you're done. They're done. You know, I didn't do it when we did the Lord's Supper the last time I preached, but I often do talk about the fact that Jesus, I call him the man of steel. I cannot tolerate these ideas that Jesus was this slightly effeminate guy that you see all. I mean, he was tough as nails. He had to be very strong. He was a carpenter. Their carpenters didn't work with 2x4s and 1x6s. They worked with big beams that they shaped. It was an enormously, intensive manual labor. So he would have been very, very physically strong. But think about what he endured: being starved, being beaten, being the crown of thorns, loss of blood, hung on the cross. Not many men would have survived any of that, much less all of it. But my favorite part is the part that reveals to us that Jesus was always in control 100% of the time. So when the cohort of Roman soldiers, which is about 600 soldiers, come to get one unarmed man in the Garden of Gethsemane, what does Jesus do? Does the centurion come up and say, we're looking for Jesus, are you him? Jesus takes command immediately. He walks up and says, who are you looking for? And centurions aren't used to Jews coming up to them and questioning them. The funny thing is, this particular centurion knew there was something different about Jesus because he answers him. Normally, he would have probably just knocked him to the ground and said, none of your business. But he says, we're looking for Jesus. And he says, I am him. But what did he actually say? He said, I am. Not I am he, I am Yahweh. When he spoke that name, what happened to the 600 soldiers? They were shoved to the ground and couldn't move. Now, imagine being one of those hardened veteran soldiers that's fought in wars, and this Jewish guy just says something, and all of a sudden you're on the ground and you can't move. All 600 of you. And then I love Jesus' sense of humor. He looks at it and says, what are you doing on the ground? Get up. We have somewhere to go. So who was in charge? The Roman army?
Jesus.
Nope. Why did Jesus go to the cross? Who made him?
He didn't.
No one. Who killed him? No one. He went of his own free will. It was God's plan. If you really want to blame somebody for killing him, that's God. Because it was God's plan from the beginning. And I think that's a super important point, because down through times, Christians have hated the Romans because they killed Jesus. And they've hated the Jews because they killed Jesus, which means those Christians had no understanding of their own Bible, because neither of those groups were the ones who carried it out, but it was God's plan. And if Jesus didn't want to go, he didn't have to go. I mean, Jesus could have spoken a word and the entire earth could have disappeared and he'd have been floating in space, but he went all the way to the cross.
And he died for those who killed him.
Exactly. Well, what did he say from the cross? Could we say this? What was that, Andrew?
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Absolutely. I'm not sure I could say that after you drove nails through my hands and feet. I'm not sure that's what would come out of my mouth. That Jesus was able to do that. Now, this idea does not mean a physical kingdom on the earth. That's not in the Bible anywhere. And this is where we take Scripture out of context, out of the overall message of the Bible, and we create something that has nothing to do with that passage of Scripture. It's a whole different, we're going to look at what it actually means. Your kingdom come on earth. Well, what is God's kingdom on earth? Or maybe I should actually say who? Us. We are God's kingdom on earth. All right? The church and Christians, which the Christians is nothing other than the church is nothing other than a group of Christians. How is God's will done in heaven? When God says something, what happens? It's done when? Immediately. So, what's he saying? He's saying, as soon as God says something in our lives, how should we respond? Immediately, just like all these great men and women of the Bible did. That's what it means for God's kingdom to come on the earth. We are his kingdom. In heaven, when God speaks, it's done the moment he speaks it. Can that be said of us? No, not most of the time. We want more information. We want to know what the end result is going to be. We want to know how hard it's going to be. What's it going to cost? All this kind of stuff. And God's like, that's none of your business. I say, do it. Do it. It's that simple. It's that simple. And that's what that means when it says your kingdom come. Because how does this define? See, Scripture does this for us and we miss it all the time. Your kingdom come. How is that defined? Your will be done. What is God's kingdom? The place where God's will is done. 100% of the time, without question, as it's done in the spiritual kingdom. When we leave this earth and leave these bodies and go to be with Him in our new physical bodies, how will God's will be done? Instantly. Because we'll be in perfect bodies with no sin and nothing other than obedience. So that's what it means. And if we pay attention, Scripture will explain to us like that. It says your kingdom come. Well, what does that mean? Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So that's what he's telling us there. So same thing that we see in the Old Testament with Abraham. Let's see where we are. All right. Back to Genesis 17. Now, that very day, Abraham circumcised all the males in his group, including his male children, which would be Ishmael, the servants he had purchased, and all the males over 8 days old, born to existing servants. He was 99, Ishmael was 13. And I bet Ishmael was thrilled when he came in and said, "Come with me." "Okay, Dad, what are we going to do?" "Never mind." So you can imagine when that guy starts walking towards him with the flint knife, he's kind of like, huh? So, imagine being one of Abraham's male servants, and he tells you, you're a grown man, and he says, "You must be circumcised." "Great, what's that?" "Not so great."
Hello.
Ouch.
So,
Yeah, they didn't have morphine or anything like that.
no. Best thing they had was some wine.
Jug of water.
Do you know later on you'll see in the Old Testament where the Jewish, a couple of the tribes, or actually it's a couple of the people of some tribes, used this to kill an entire city. Because remember they walked by the city, I think it's Shechem, and they see the sister of the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 forefathers of Israel, and they want to marry her. And this guy rapes her. Then wants to marry her, and so what they do is they say, "Okay, we'll be at peace if all your males will get circumcised like us." And then the next day, after they've all been circumcised and can't move, they go in and slaughter every single man. They kill every single one of them and bring great shame to Jacob and to their tribe. And they were very tricky about that. Genesis 18, verse 1. It says, "And the Lord appeared to him." So we don't know what the time period is. We just jump to the next narrative where God appears to him again. "Appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre." This seemed to be a place that Abraham really liked because he's hanging around this place a lot. And the oaks of Mamre, remember Mamre was a man. And these are the oaks that belong to him. And they're a pretty rare tree there because all you have to say is the oaks of Mamre and everybody knows where that is. Because big trees don't really grow in Israel. The only big trees in that area are the cedars of Lebanon. And that's why they were such an enormously valuable commodity. And that's why there's only a very small group of those trees left today on Mount Lebanon that's in a protected park because they cut them all down over hundreds and thousands of years for ship mass. Was a huge usage of it. And remember, Solomon got lots of it for building the temple because the whole inside of the temple was lined with cedar from Mount Lebanon. Okay, "And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, 'O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant.'" So he's in relatively good shape at 99 because, how did he greet him? He ran. I don't know about you, but I don't run very much. He ran to greet him because he's very moved by the fact that God's, and somehow he can tell that they're from God. They're not just regular men. They look like men, but somehow Abraham can tell they're not men. They're angels in human form that represent the Lord. Let's see. He says, "Let a little water be brought." This is verse 4. "Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after you may pass on." since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Now, one of the things I always found interesting about this is you had to wait a while to get a meal. It wasn't like go to the fridge and get some meat. You go to the herd, you pick out an animal, then you got to slaughter it, then you got to butcher it, then you got to cook it. You know, and there's not bread laying around. She's got to go make the bread. You know, so people back then had a lot more patience than we have today for things.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's no refrigeration. So what do you kill half a cow, or how do you do that?
Well,
That must have
normally
been a
they would
deal.
only kill that much of an animal if they had lots of people to feed. But they also did salt it, dry it, and smoke it as well, like they did later on.
Vegetables.
So there were ways to preserve it, but generally, yeah, they did more fresh meat than anything. And so, see, I just heard that beep again, and I do not know where it's coming from.
Yeah,
Did you hear it?
Yeah, I did too.
Good, I'm not losing my mind there.
Oh, we should have said that. We
Those
didn't
that are in
hear
the choir, I think you guys need to go. Is that 2/3 of the class?
it. It's about two.
Okay, now, we were told where Abraham was.
There he goes.
Abraham was sitting, it says, in the door of his tent where it was cool. So I thought I'd show you what a Bedouin tent looks like. It's very likely that Abraham's tent looked very much like this. And the Bedouin tents, you'll see in a minute, they're not like these rudimentary, rough living tents. They're like fabulously expensive motorhomes
Right.
that they carry around with them as they travel all over. See the land behind it? That's pretty much what the whole area looks like. There's not a lot of food and water and so on and so forth. So that's a Bedouin tent, but this is somewhat porous, and they lift up the sides so that the breeze, plus the hot air will rise, and it'll draw air. So Abram would have been sitting up here, just in the front, because you know underneath here it's going to be hotter than it is here, and there's a nice breeze that comes by. So that's where he's sitting. And he sees these guys walk up. Somehow he knows that they're representatives of God. It doesn't tell us how he knows, and they can't be that different looking because they go into Sodom and Gomorrah and nobody recognizes them as anything other than just regular humans. But either God just told Abraham or somehow he could tell. I would think that they would kind of radiate power. You know, these are angelic beings in human form. Same, I believe Jesus radiated power.
Oh, yeah.
That when you walked up to him, you could tell there's something different about this guy partly because of the way people treat him. He does all kinds of things that should have gotten him killed that doesn't. And people don't mess with him at all, really, until the very end. So this is just an inside of a common one, if you can see that fairly well. They usually have beautiful tapestries all around the walls. The floor is completely covered with very expensive handmade carpets. A lot of them in modern times, have generators, and they have dish on the tent to skip TV. Believe it or not, out in the middle of nowhere, they'll get their TV stations. And I imagine in modern times they probably have cell phones, if not sat phones, as well. But yeah, they're very nice and can be extremely luxurious inside. And there's a whole tourism industry to go over there and stay in a Bedouin tent, you know, and experience the kind of life that they live. And this is also what made the Arabs so tough as a people. They live in a harsh desert where, you know, it's tough to live, and you got to be tough to live there. Just like the Native Americans in the Southwest were very, very tough because, again, they lived in a very inhospitable environment because it's so dry here. Now, as I said, he's in good shape because he runs to them. Now, he is a great and wealthy man that is probably looked up to by all kinds of people. Remember, he and his 308 men defeated an army of probably 30 to 40,000 and absolutely caused them to break and run. Remember that when they took Lot and they fought against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the 5 cities of the plain? So he would have quite the reputation, and everywhere he would go, he'd be treated as a prince. He's also extremely wealthy. So in a lot of ways, he's very powerful and very wealthy. But what does he do as soon as he sees these guys? He runs from them and then runs to them, and what does he do? Bows down. Shows he's humble. That he knows these are from the Lord, these men, and it doesn't bother him a bit. What's the hardest thing in the world for us men to do? Bow down to somebody else. It's very difficult for us to do. And yet, Abraham shows us that he's a humble man, runs out and bows down to him. And then he wants to take care of them. He wants to feed them. They're angels. Do they need food? Do they need rest? No. But he wants to do it, so they let him. So, and this is the normal hospitality of nomadic peoples almost everywhere. Most nomadic peoples are very hospitable. The Bedouins are very hospitable, as long as you're not a Jew, because they're Arabs, remember, Muslim Arabs. But they are generally very hospitable. If you show up at their tent, they feel obligated to feed you, to give you shelter and rest and whatever else you need, water, whatever. And as you read about, if you read about different nomadic peoples, most of them are that way. And I think they're that way because they wander and they know how important it is to have a place to go, to get food, shelter, and so on and so forth when you're in these areas. Okay.
Ken,
Yes.
did they take those big tents when they traveled?
Yeah.
Or did that stay?
No,
That has to weigh a
They
lot.
rolled all that up. Well, it's in pieces, but they roll it all up. They put it on camels. And then they move on with their camel herds and they set it up. And they might stay in a place for a few days, but they generally are constantly traveling because the forage is not very good. And they have to go to new pastures all the time. And yep, they're really good at, just like Native Americans with the teepees. Not all, of course. If you watch TV, you think all Native Americans had teepees. There was only really the Plains Indians that used teepees. The others built all different kinds of homes. In fact, in the eastern United States, they actually built towns and cities with wooden buildings and crops and irrigation and all kinds of stuff. That kind of thing. But, so yeah, they move all this stuff all the time as they move on. Now, the Bedouins, the actual nomadic Bedouins, are disappearing because they're by and large moving to the cities that have been built up around, Saudi Arabia and other areas, which is happening all over the world. Rural people are coming into the cities all over the world. That's why the cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, because life is easier in the city, money's more available in the city. You can start a business in a city because you got lots of customers that you can't do. And nomadic life is hard. It's very hard. Like you said, can you imagine having to tear down and set this up on a regular basis? Now, I think the Bedouins are a lot like the Native Americans. It was the women's job to set up and tear down, not the men's. They're the ones. In fact, the women for Native Americans, when like white men came along and tried to help, they'd like slap them and tell them to get away. It's not man's work, and they don't want it messed up. And they were the ones that. They also did all of the skinning and tanning, and like when the Lakota, the Sioux killed buffalo, the men didn't go out there and skin them and gut them and butcher them. The women did, and the kids. They're the ones that went out and did all that work.
You want something done right.
It's like when I worked in the mines, we had a particular piece of equipment that had, instead of like circuit boards with soldered joints in them that connect everything, these actually had what's called wire wrap, where you take a wire and you wrap it around this terminal sticking out of the back of where the circuit board goes, and that's how so you have to get those little tiny wires in all the right places. And I was talking to the guys that had built this machine, designed this machine, and they said they would not allow a man into the room where that was done. It was all women. He said, because every time we've let a man in here, he invariably puts the wires on the wrong studs, and then it doesn't work.
Plus his fingers are too big to do it.
It's just women seem to be in many ways a lot more meticulous. And I've heard that about many kinds of assembly where they will only let women, they won't let men do it because we mess it all up, because our brains are going other places and whatnot. So I almost told him, well, that's discrimination. All right, where am I? Chapter 18, verse 9. They said to him, where is Sarah your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, basically she's gone through menopause, can't have kids, right? After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? So she laughs with no faith, you know. The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. Could you imagine arguing with God? But it just shows how bad we humans are about, I didn't do it. You know, when we were kids, our parents would do that and they'd say, I have witnesses, I still didn't do it. You know, and they know for a fact you did do it. But we will go to our graves swearing we didn't do it.
That woman you gave me.
Are we back? It's a woman's fault? Started with Adam.
Way better.
So Sarah laughed, but God didn't. He didn't do anything to her. He just said, no, you will have a son, and he will be born about this time next year. Because remember, is this promise dependent upon Sarah and Abraham? No. It's a promise where God said, I chose you, you're going to have a son, and you're going to be the father of a great nation. End of story. Whether their faith stays intact or not, it's going to happen. Because their faith has wavered multiple times. Remember this, a covenant isn't both parties have to do something. A covenant is an unending promise from a greater authority to a lesser authority, from a king to a peasant or whatever, something, or a king to a lesser king, those kinds of things. Verse 16, then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. It's interesting, has he become a great and mighty nation today? Israel would not be considered a great and mighty nation. Now, during the time of Solomon, it was. But that's really the only time. That's really, though, speaking more to far forward in time to the 1,000-year reign of Christ, when the nation of Israel rules the world, the entire world. For I have chosen him, meaning Abraham, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. Guess what? So if the Lord may bring two, I didn't print the rest of that out.
Bring to Abraham what he has promised him.
Okay? So, they're looking down towards Sodom, because what are these guys there to do? Remember the story? Oh, yeah. Well, it's because I'm done. That was the last picture. They're there to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and do what? What, Calvin? Utterly destroy it, to where there's nothing left. No one can ever live there again. When you make God really mad, and he acts, it's severe. Not only did he destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and burn and kill everybody in there, but he rained sulfur and all kinds of stuff down so that no one could ever live there again. And that's why we believe Sodom is at the southern end of the Dead Sea. Sodom and Gomorrah were there, because archaeologists have found remnants of buildings and cities there. But at the same time, that's the place, I showed you some pictures last time, I'll bring some more next time, where there were the balls of sulfur laying all over the ground that can only come from out of being formed in the air, like the way sleet and stuff forms, something similar to that. And then also it's a place filled with where oil comes to the surface of the ground now. And they've got the bitumen pits, that's really natural oil, raw crude oil. And that's why we think it's probably there, because it's such a wasteland that nothing can survive there. But yet there's remnants of cities there, some of which housed 100,000 people or more. And if you go back, you remember with Lot, it said that the area where Sodom and Gomorrah was like the Garden of Eden. That it was lush and thick and well watered and all that kind of stuff until God utterly wipes it out, which is what these two angels are here to do. And they're going to go down and take care of it. And God's going to tell Abraham what he's going to do. He's not going to hide this from him. It also shows that when you reach a certain level of immorality, God ends you. As a city, as a nation, as an empire. And it's funny that empires all go the same way. When empires become wealthy and extremely powerful, homosexuality becomes rampant. Most people don't realize that during the time of even the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, very much in the Greek and the Romans, that pedophilia was considered more natural than heterosexual. And homosexuality was extremely common. And I'm not here to say that homosexuals are the worst people on the planet. That's not it at all. But what God is showing us is that when a culture reaches that level, they've reached a level of depravity where God says, that's it, we're done. And it happens over and over again. And watch what's happening in our own country. How we're changing over the years, like every other country and nation that's come before us. It's the same exact thing that happens over and over again. It's just the way of man. And that's why when we get to the book of Revelation, what part of the world's not mentioned? This part of the world, yeah, because we're no longer a power or an influence. All of that is centered in Asia, in the East, and the peoples there. And look what's happening. What's happening with the economies in Asia? They're becoming the most powerful economies in the world. What's happening with the Western economies? We've gotten ourselves into enormous debt that we can never get out of. And eventually, the interest payments on our debt in America is going to get to the point to where there's not enough taxes to pay it. And that's when our country will be in a huge problem. That's where we will have more like an economic collapse. Because we simply can't pay. You know? And that's when then people stop buying your bonds. When they stop buying your bonds, there's no new money coming in. I mean, when you really think about it, America is running a giant Ponzi scheme. Because we're taking the money from the new investors to keep the country going.
Right.
You know, and eventually we're going to take on so much debt that we just can't do it anymore.
Keep it money.
And the only thing that's kept us going to this point is we are the world standard for money. And when that ceases to be, then we'll be in big trouble. Same thing that happened to England. England, the pound, was the world currency. And when they lost that, they lost their power, their influence, and their world dominance. And China is working very, very hard to get the American dollar taken away as the world standard currency. They'd like to see theirs become the currency. And it might, you know, if they get their good. Our economy is still bigger and more powerful. But they've got so much more potential, having over 1 billion people, that it's not that much
Well,
longer.
why is that happening? Is that intentional, or is it just out of greed or stupidity?
On their part? I mean, their economy growing? Or-
No, ours falling down.
Oh, no, it's
And going into debt and,
it's
you know,
just the way of man. That's the way it's always happened, all down through history. All the empires and kingdoms, they eventually get to where they have to start borrowing money and hiring mercenaries, and that's when they fall apart.
But I mean, why is that? Greed or stupidity?
It's
or-
greed, it's stupidity, it's sinfulness, it's selfishness, it's all the things that make us human, but it's also what makes us make these horrible decisions. You know, that type of thing.
And they didn't read the Bible.
Yeah, Emily?
They're talking about, they're gonna be
Then you get on hands and
cutting
knees.
back social security because there's not enough people working right now and paying into it.
Yeah.
That's always been a concern of mine since I was young, was that by the time I would retire, that all the projections were saying there'd be more retired people than there are people working, and Social Security comes out of the income that's coming in, not some big fund that's supposed to be there, but it isn't.
But why do we have to suffer for what other people are doing?
Because it's just part of the earth, life on the earth. It's just, we chose to sin, we live in a sinful earth, and so God lets sin play out.
I want to go home.
So do I. So does almost every Christian on the planet. Absolutely. You know, that's why for us, dying is not a bad thing. I mean, it's sad for those we leave behind, but for us, it's a good thing. You know, we're out of here, we're done, and we don't have to mess with this anymore. The one thing to remember, though, I don't want everybody to leave depressed, is that no matter what happens, America is not our economy. What's our economy?
God.
God. That's right. Who provides for us?
God.
God. Who can provide for his people no matter what?
God.
God. He may not provide in the way we have now, because we have way more than we need right now, but God will take care of his people. You know. So, but it's just interesting to watch what man does over and over and over and over. We really don't learn from history. You know, we could go read history and see, you know, this is a really bad idea, but it doesn't matter. Man's greed, man's lust for power, man's desire for leisure. You know, that's one of the things that destroys nations is our desire for leisure. It's when you give us leisure time that all this bad stuff happens. When we have time to, you know.
Yeah,
That's why I think it's funny that so many people think the heart of man is basically good. It's like, well, then how come every time man has leisure time, he does not do good? He does evil every single time. Every time. All right, we got to go.